We'll start the first session, material conditions. And materiality has been an important part of both of the projects, actually, both architecture in the making and architecture in effect. And in architecture in effect, we have been interested especially in the contemporary significance of architecture as a material agent for social change, social and political change. What are the effects of architecture and architectural materialities? In Architectural in the Making, the theme was called Material Mechanisms, and the focus was more on how to imagine and produce new kinds of material assemblages, given the new technologies, for example, that we have, but also what to study the roles that these new material assemblages can play. So before I introduce now the speakers of the material culture or the material condition session, rather, I would say a few words about the theme as a kind of an introduction. The question of materiality and form has always been at the core of architectural research and architectural theory in terms of style and expression, and as a philosophical issue concerning the different roles and impacts of built form and matter. In recent years, materiality has also become an important issue in philosophy, cultural studies, and social sciences. For example, through theories such as actor network theory, material semiotics, non-representational theory, new materialism. And the reasons for the rise of materiality, the so-called or sometimes called material turn, because researchers often like this expression, the turn, follows in the wake of postmodern and post-structuralist focus on discourse. And there are of course, many reasons for this change, but I will here just shortly mention two. First of all, the sheer proliferation of new kinds of artifacts, together with an increased and polarized consumption, also comes with a series of new societal and political problems concerning, for example, issues of justice, inequality, sustainability, and health. In the wake of current global challenges, it has become urgent to develop theories of and methods that in a more direct and detailed manner can address and critically analyze the role of materiality, including, of course, architecture. Second of all, the role of materiality has for various reasons been downplayed or just downright neglected in a lot of discourses. This might have to do with the discursive bias of earlier postmodern perspectives, but also with what Daniel Miller called the humility of things. Materialities do their work silently and invisibly and are not so easy to account for. Perhaps, as Miller puts it, objects are important not because they are evident and physically constrain or enable, but quite the opposite. It's often precisely because we do not see them. The less we are aware of them, the more fully they can determine our expectations by setting the scene and ensuring appropriate behavior without being open to challenge. So how can we then investigate or visualize the role of architectural matter and form? I will end here by just mention two aspects or challenges, perhaps, but we will hear more of these later with the presenters in this session. And it's the problem of material agency and the problem of scale. At the heart of this renewed interest in materiality, we can also find a heated discussion about material agency. What kind of difference do materialities bring into a situation, and how can we describe this effect? The focus of the discussion on material agency is, of course, not to inscribe intentions or feelings into things or inert materials. Materialities always have their effects through relations or through a distributed net of different actors. But rather it is to investigate how we can describe matter as something active and forceful instead of just being passive receiver of abstract form and ideas. Because matter animates us, and I here agree with Isabel Stenger's recent ambition of reclaiming animism. As she says, it is, as she says, a matter of recovering the capacity to honor experience, any experience we care for, as not ours, but rather as animating us, making us witness to what is not us. So finally, we also have the matter of scale, and this is where I have done a lot of research myself. In studies of material culture, discrete objects such as clothes, cell phones, bags, new technologies and what have you, has been a fundamental part in how public space or the use of public space has changed in the city. In urban design, we have seen research looking at benches, facades, different design elements on the scale of the square and the street. And in urban morphology, we have research that looks at materialities at the whole scale of the city, spatial structures, plots, street networks, and so on. The problem here is that there is a division of labor between these different disciplines: urban design, urban morphology, material culture, and perhaps even global studies, where the role of materiality are handled in isolated discussions. This thing, I think, is a challenge for architectural researchers ahead, to see how can we discuss material roles at all scales. And the problem here is actually to find out what scales do materialities and material culture take, and on what scale do they make a difference. This is a kind of an empirical question that we need to attend to. And here I think it's important to develop a more, in the widest sense of the word, ecological approach to materialities and to the effect of architecture. Thank you for that. That was a short introduction, or I tried to keep it short. And I will now introduce our speakers for this session. The first one is Professor Albena Yaneva from Manchester. She's a professor in architectural theory, and she's also a visiting professor at Lund University as the Lise Meitner professor. So welcome, Albena. The floor is yours. Let's see if I can get your...
Thank you very much, Mattias. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will talk today about 5 ways to make architecture political, which is also the title of my recent book. What is the best story we tell to illustrate the political effects of architecture in building technologies? What comes first in mind is, of course, the classic parable of social control, illustrated by the prism of Jeremy Bentham, known as a panopticon, which is a classic example we all know and we very often discuss in research and teaching. Another classic parable of architecture's power to generate control is the tale about the famous bridges of Robert Moses, built in the 1920s, which is another example we all know and we very often refer to. In the 1980s, London Winner published an article titled, "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" Winner argued that the artifacts and material spatial arrangements embody social relations and contain political properties. The classic example used is again the low bridges, the low overpasses on the bridges of Long Island. One of the many examples, but this becomes the iconic example, as we all know. Winner argued that the height of the bridge was not randomly chosen, and the height was deliberately, all these bridges were deliberately built with a height of 8.5 feet, so as to make impossible the presence of buses on the parkways. And this very specific design filtered and limited access of racial minorities and low-income groups to Jones Beach, the acclaimed park of Moses. A recent documentary, so this is the kind of height problem, as the buses were 12 feet high, it was impossible to get them through the low bridges. A recent documentary produced by the Canadian Centre of Architecture and the young curator Francesco Garutti goes back to this debate from the 80s and reenacts the whole debate because this article of Winner triggered a big debate between social constructivist and active network theory scholars, but also this was a big debate within the field of urban studies and political science. So this documentary brings us back to the debate, and for the first time we see the bridge, the real artifact, the artifact. The bridge is brought into the debate as an object. Through the film and the kind of slow ethnographic techniques used within this documentary, we're able to revisit the debate and also to witness how weak, how anemic Wiener's interpretation was. As we again only witness the height of the bridge, and there's no mention of materiality, shape, construction, technological innovation, users, and so on, nor is there a mention of natural forces and how they happen to be channeled in a specifically shaped artifact, a bridge. On the other side, only one type of politics is there, and only one type of politics is discussed, racial politics. So we see the simplistic reductions performed by Wiener. On the one side, politics is reduced to racial politics, and on the other side, the rich materiality and agency of the bridge as a technology, as an infrastructure, is reduced to the height. And we see how simplistic this kind of reduction is, because the height and racism are put into a kind of equation of causal explanation, and in this way, Wiener reproduces the divide between politics on the one hand and architecture, technology, infrastructure on the other. Why is this example interesting for me, and why I want to spend some of my 10 minutes on it? I would like to focus on the nature of the bridge in this discussion and the nature of the questions we ask about it. The bridge, as we see through the documentary, is neither simply material, nor is it simply political. It can only be understood as the intersection and balance of a range of forces, from the political to the natural, from the real to the metaphorical. The documentary shows the materiality of the bridge with a series of close-ups, and we can witness the different dimensions of the bridge. We can see the bridge in action, because there's always something happening. People are restoring the bridge. There's some failures, tracks who cannot pass through the low bridge, and then they fail. So the artifact is there, is being used, it's falling apart, and then it's being reassembled again. So we see that the bridge never exists on its own. But it cannot exist without builders, construction and maintenance workers, planners, senators, policemen, engineers, traffic controllers. It is simplistic indeed to just mention one actor, the man who built New York. It's usually a powerful white man who built New York, just one actor on one side of this equation, and the dimension of the bridge, the height. We need instead a much larger crowd of actors, a much larger crowd of actors that would show the complexity of the bridge as an artifact and what the bridge does. The key question in this debate in the 80s, what do artifacts have politics? What is an artifact? All these questions are also wrong. These are not the questions that we should be asking. These questions trap all interpretations of buildings and infrastructure in metaphysics of essence. Instead, we should be asking questions like, how does design become political? What does this bridge do? Where and how? What are its modalities of action? How, when, to what extent, and under what circumstances can design become political or generate political effects? In other words, the question is not any longer whether a bridge, a building, a city infrastructure can embody a certain type of politics, racial or other. It is rather about what this particular artifact or infrastructure does and how it enacts politics. These classic examples makes us rethink the long relationship between architecture and politics. Existing attempts to connect architecture and politics typically strive to reveal the politics behind design or the design techniques disguised as politics. In the existing scholarship in architecture, architecture is considered as an important factor in the construction of national imaginaries. Buildings are seen as social classifying devices, and they are very often powerful metaphors for the social, powerful metaphors for social relations. Architecture's relation to politics is commonly understood in the light of traditional foundational theories of politics related to ideology, state, nation, government, policies, and activism. Politics is separated from architecture in the sense that politics is considered as this separate domain of action, which has its own logics, institutions, practices, and it is very often outside architecture, outside the remit of architecture, and far from the architectural objects and processes. And what we do is to trace linear causal relationships between politics and architecture, very similar to the equation height of the bridge, racism. In the literature, we always find an asymmetric equation. So politics is used as a very specific type of causality to account for aspects of architecture. And some of the most common asymmetric projections and ontologies read, architecture reflects politics and can produce political effects. A whole body of literature around this. Architects are agents of politics and power. Yeah. Architectural styles mirror political shifts. We have a huge body of literature there, so I'm just summarizing an entire field. Politics is imprinted on cities, the whole literature on divided cities. Architecture helps the construction of identities and urban imaginaries. Building types embody politics, a vast literature there as well. So the architectural literature has preciously preserved this dualist spirit between people and things, between the freestanding material world of architecture and infrastructure, which is out there, created, fabricated, built, governed, and fully mastered by powerful humans. So this dualism is there, and it's very much presented in the architectural literature. The overall ontological vision here is an asymmetric dualism between the world as knowable, buildable, and controllable, and humans as genuine agents of creativity. The key question in this debate remains who acts, who decides, and how this is reflected on built form and urban fabrics. However, in practice, architects, urban practitioners, planners fail to exemplify this asymmetric ontology. The ethnographies of architectural practices, a tradition that started with the pioneering work of Professor Dana Cuff, who is probably in the room, and the studies that followed after that, developed in the past 20 years, I would say, have demonstrated that architects, planners, urban practitioners at work are far from being powerful subjects deciding, rationally planning the course of their actions. They're far from mastering materials or controlling the world. There's often a model that talks back to those designers, or a simulation or a sketch that talks back and controls or enters in a dialogue with those designers. So designers and urban practitioners engage in a rather symmetric and open-ended and performative creative process. If we follow the design in the making, planning in the making, people in the process of strolling in buildings and interacting with them, we suddenly start to think about the world in non-dualist terms. And more importantly, we see that there are an indefinite number of ways to stage a non-dualist ontology. So here I'll talk only about 5 ways, or 5 ways to make architecture political. We can either follow the agency of objects in practices of inhabitation and the agency of different artifacts that guide us in space. We can follow the agency of materials, models, sketches in design, experimentation, and in the practices of design making, or the different ways a city is being reassembled and the multiple realities of the city come together in an image that become an iconic image, or, for instance, processes of building renovation where this agency of materials could be also witnessed, or, for instance, processes of presenting architecture object where the architect is in a situation of engaging actively with the political. So these are very quick examples, but if we follow these processes, we see that architectural objects appear less as reflections of power and politics that is out there. The need to explain architecture becomes less significant as this dynamic view, when we are in the world of the practitioners, this dynamic view allows a symmetric treatment of the shaping of the architectural and the political. And if you allow me to, in the last minute, to have a little zoom in a project I followed as one of these examples, as one of these 5 examples. This is the Marina Bay project in Singapore, which I followed from the very beginning. This project, of course, can be understood as a powerful symbol of economic power, and it's a rather symbolic building at this stage, but instead of analyzing how this building can reflect power, we could look at a very specific situation of presenting this project in the practice of Moshe Safdie, the architect, which we see, and of course we have some planners and Proto users discussing the project with the architect in the situation of presenting the model of the building to be. So in this situation, we see that it's extremely important to okay, you have the image, to rather shift the question from who acts, who participates. Is it a small group of technocrats or a bigger group affected by urban policies? It is rather, and you have the image in mind, important to focus on the relations, on the groupings and the associations, on the agencies and the different scenarios of use, on the politics that is deployed in this very specific situation when an architect presents a model. In the very situation of enactment of design. So my suggestion here today is to shift the question from who acts towards the question of how specific capacities to act are performed through design and urban practices. How does design engage people? How do different design, construction, and renovation practices transform human experiences and affect human trajectories? So instead of focusing who acts, is it Moshe Safdie or is it the planner around this table of models, the question would be what acts? The model, the whole disposition, the propensity of things that we have in this room around the models and all the materiality of the situation. So the whole disposition acts all together. And we should turn our attention to these very specific practices that shift the trajectory of things and people. And there is the political. There we unravel a different type of politicals, and that is how a site of architectural presentation, a building site, an architectural practice become political sites. In other words, architecture plays an active role in doing politics, as the political emerges on these sites, politics is never longer about demonstration, petitions in the streets, ideologies. Politics does not happen in the headquarters of political parties. Politics also happens in situations like this, on a very specific site of presenting a model. So doing politics is no longer a procedural attempt to reach a good decision or to achieve a consensus. Doing politics is rather a substantive move to materially reconfigure the practices, reshape the connections, and redistribute agency in a slow and relationally efficient way. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you sit? I invite you to sit over at the stage, and we will gather all the speakers eventually of the session in these chairs. Albena? We can touch it. Okay, so the next speaker is Alberto Altés, who is a researcher and an architect. Please come forward. I think we will need to change your... Is this one right?
It's okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It's really a luxury to be here. I think that I wanted to start by saying that it's been a luxury to be part of these years, and it's a luxury to be able to be here. And I think that it's quite important to reflect about how privileged. I think I want to share that I feel that I'm privileged because of being here, but I also feel that we are all privileged because of the chances that we have of having this environment. And I want to start from there, which has to do with these issues of matters of care and the notion of care that I want to talk about. I've been assistant professor in Umeå School of Architecture until July this year, and now I am going to be moving to TU Delft for a research project at the theory chair there, and I hope that is not going to be by losing contact or the consequence of losing contact with many fantastic colleagues that I have had here. So I hope to be able to come back. And since it's really short, we have barely 5-6 minutes to discuss things, I thought that it was interesting to share a few sketchy notes about this new research project, which I'm starting, and that is, of course, based on issues that I've been working with and that have been coming up on the basis of my PhD research. And this is about, I would say, rather than a theory of responsible design, a kind of book of notes and recommendations toward responsible worlding, which would be based on developing something that could be called a feminist, queer ethics of encounter and care in design. But since the panel is about material conditions, I thought that it was interesting to start with my own particular specific entanglements with matter and materials. This is what I was doing a week ago. I was having to devise a way to cut those boards because it was needed to have those boards cut, and we didn't have any more machines because the people that were actually cutting those boards were left and were gone, and we needed to think of a way. You know, this is also not so much about presenting a project that I'm involved in, which is also the case, but more trying to add to a layer of what is it that I'm doing. And then that's part of this park that I'm involved in designing and in building, literally in building, and which is a very particular kind of complex set of material conditions, and unusual material conditions where people are actually present in a building site in the north of Sweden while this park is being built and things are being used. And then this is even more recent. This is just Monday, where I literally spent the whole day building up this frame for a wall, which will be then filled up with concrete and other material condition. But what I want to talk about is these encounters, interventions, matters of care. It could be also just 2 words, delay and care. And I'm going to try to go through a line of words very, very quickly that summarize these sketchy notes about the research project. But we could say that it is an attempt at building that ethics of care, that feminist or queer ethics of care in design through the combination of this dwelling perspective, this performative perspective, and then these 3 dimensions or vectors. The idea of a return to the body as the first and probably the ultimate space-making apparatus that we have at hand. The idea that we are becoming with, we are making with, that is not just that we are constantly changing, but that we are changing with others and with other things, not necessarily others that are always human. And also that it's not enough with rearranging space and making sense of that rearrangement, but that we have to increase the amount of love in the planet. It sounds maybe a bit romantic, but I truly believe that we have to shift architectures and spatial practices, ethos, by focusing on the increase of love, the sheer increase of love, which is, I think, also a very kind of anti-cynical stance. So I want to start with these three quotes as a kind of frame. It seems like I'm never starting, but I will end very fast. In the universe, I know there is only the contingency of fluid and free-floating forces when I conduct the orchestra of space, commanding figments of time in the temporary shelter of my quicksilver ideas. Their containers are never erected with the stones of dead builders, but are instead undetermined, undecidable, and potentially endless. This is from the Book of Recommendations, Choreography as an Aesthetics of Change. I really like the idea of a book of recommendations. It's a very, very nice concept. Staying with the trouble is both more serious and more lively. Staying with the trouble requires making odd kin. That is, we require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations in hot compost piles. We become with each other or not at all. And this is really to discuss and challenge some of the things we've been talking about before. We've been hearing from Albena. We have to do away with this notion of urgency associated with politics, because it's the contrary of love. That's where it starts. Politics is love. This is Pedro Costa, a Portuguese filmmaker. So there's a different location of politics or of the political. So I'm trying to talk about the design theory and brackets, because I really don't want it to be a design theory or a theory, but something that is more like recommendations or a book of recommendations or notes, but about responsible world in action, responsible design, theory of care in design. And for that, I have also a few other thoughts that I use to frame this line of words. And then, of course, what would be nice is to be able to go through all of those words and explain all of those things. But I can't. But at least I'm going to just name the words, and then I'm going to throw them, and I hope that this is going to work as a kind of engine to feed discussions today or in the breaks. Becoming with, thinking that we are always co-producing the things that we are entangled with. Production, the things that we produce, is not owned but owed. So we learn, we owe the things that we produce to others. They belong to others rather than ourselves. Responsibility as this antidote to the cynicism that invades everything we do today. The idea of correspondence as a way to inaugurate a community not founded on the defense of a priori defined common principles or shared principles, but on the commitment that we will get along together. We don't have those principles. We're just going to commit to getting along together. The idea of vulnerability as something to welcome. I want to be able to be heard, to feel, to cry, and to fail, and then to go on moving from that. And the idea also that that kind of responsible approach to design, to worlding, has to do much more with an attentional mind than an intentional mind. The operations of the attentional mind are not cognitive, but ecological. And attendre is to wait. So there's also the idea that in order to be able to be attentive, to have an attentional mind, we need also to wait and to delay our actions. Encounter as the central category, it's a theory of ethics of care and encounter. Inhabitation as a way to gain access to sites and situations, and to gain actually the right to be allowed to design. And intravention, which is the concept that my colleagues in the environment already know about, as that kind of alternative to working from the outside, the idea of intervention and signaling and already being part of the spaces in which we operate when we do operate, which of course requires a definition of a situation as a complex entanglement of flows, materials, and movements. This allows us to know from the inside and hopefully to perform by focusing on what a thing does rather than what a thing looks like. So not so much what is causing, but what is it that is going on? What is it that we are performing or doing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Then I'd like to welcome Catharina Gabrielsson, who is an associate professor at KTH Stockholm.
Yes, thank you, Mattias. I'm taking the opportunity to present a book that we worked with and that came out, I think it was last year, and it was edited by myself, Hélène Frichot, and Jonathan Metzger, and called Deleuze and the City, and published by Edinburgh University Press. So I'm stepping in for Hélène Frichot, who couldn't make it today, so I haven't had time to prepare much, so I'm going to be very brief. This first slide shows some of the current volumes in this series called Deleuze Connections, published by Edinburgh University Press, and I'm just showing this to give you a sense of the amount of books currently being produced and being put on the market, and just putting a question mark both in terms of how we're supposed to forever be making these publications and so on, but whoever has the time to read them carefully and to take them to heart. And we never even had time to launch this book or talk about it properly once it was out there. And I also want to point to the increasingly problematic state of academic people doing free work for the big academic publishers who are actually making loads and loads of money of the kind of work that we're putting into it forever as part of our employment. So that's a kind of problem scenario, the conditions for doing research, for publishing, and so on and so forth. But this slide also shows an enormous interest in the work of Deleuze and Deleuze and Guattari for a range of different disciplines and fields. And you can see here some of the titles. I think that today there are over 30 books in this series. So there's Deleuze in literature, Deleuze in education, Deleuze in politics, Deleuze in history, Deleuze in design, Deleuze in ethics, and so on and so forth. And for us, it seemed like a timely thing to finally get to the point of addressing Deleuze and the City, which we think would be you would imagine that this kind of approach to Deleuze could have entered earlier in the series, because obviously Deleuze and his work together with Guattari is incredibly interesting and useful in terms of addressing cities, what they are, their mechanisms, how they work, what they do, and so on and so forth. And clearly Deleuze and Guattari are extremely important for much of the current research then thinking going on in what you could call neo-materialist thinking and assemblage thinking and so on and so forth. Their work is really sort of foundational for a lot of what's happening today, I would say, especially in terms of material conditions. So how do I change the slide? Okay. So this is how we sort of pitch the book at the back cover. I'm just going to read it to you. Defining the livelihood for the majority of the world's population, the question of the city has risen to the fore as one of the most urgent focal points of our time, uniting concerns across the terrain of climate policies, global financing, localized struggles, and multidisciplinary science. This book rests on a conviction that philosophy is crucially important for advancing knowledge on cities, but also for allowing us to envisage new forms of urban life in a more sustainable future. Deleuze and the City brings together some of the most original thinkers and accomplished scholars in contemporary urban studies, showing how Deleuze and Guattari are essential for our thinking through the multiscalar, uneven and contested landscapes that constitute the city today. Dispelling the old question of what the city is, asking instead what it can do, the compilation of essays in this book provide a nuanced yet consistent mapping of the ongoings in concrete urban settings across the globe, investigating sites as closely or widely set apart as a Swiss ski resort, the New York subway, homeless shelters in Turin, or the herbicidal refurbishments of Haifa. Drawing on yet extending from the explicit references to the city in Deleuze and Guattari's writings, this book follows their philosophical project closely. So I think it's important also to mention that understanding the kind of particular context from which Deleuze and Guattari collaboration derives from, and its kind of spatial setting in Paris as part of the, what was it called there? The setup that they did. Oh, I can't remember, but anyway. Serfi, exactly. And it's this point, this kind of outset is something that Sven-Olof Wallerstein is mapping out in his chapter for this book, but also understanding them as a way to rethink politics and social change after the events of May 1968 that completely sort of undid the foundation for a Marxist understanding of how kind of political change comes about and who is the subject, the historic subject of social change. And them coming up with a much more kind of non-hierarchical and complex system of forces, agents, actors collaborating in non-determinate ways. And as part of this also a collection of very useful concepts that we can use to try to understand these kinds of diagrammatic forces operating in the kind of material and social environment. And concepts such as territorialization, deterritorialization, and reterritorialization, I think, are extremely useful for understanding these kind of flows of events and how things come together, affect each other, and let off. So here's just to let you show the contents of this book. And we decided we wouldn't sort of combine things under different sections, for instance, by assemblages or codes or something. Instead we opted for this way of sorting out the chapters where they kind of link on to each other in a kind of fluid way, more like cliffhangers from one chapter to the other. And we also made efforts to get a kind of geographical, not representation, but to ask people to actually write from very specific positions, geographical positions from different places and sites. So we try to avoid the kind of writings that take on a purely kind of theoretical or philosophical approach, but to find localized accounts, you can say. So I'm just going to just as again as an illustration, just to say a few words about my own chapter, which is chapter 14, Folded Ground, Escape from Cape Town. And my chapter is sort of, I'm trying to think through the relationship between the city and its supposed other, which I took to be the desert. And of course the desert is extremely important in the writings of Deleuze and Guattari, the idea of the nomadic thinking, and so on and so forth. And in the 60s and 70s there was a huge interest as well in kind of hunters and gatherers and the original affluent society, part of that whole critique about Western progress and so on and so forth. So in a very concrete way, I left Cape Town, where I was based at the time, and I was extremely interested in tracing and trying to understand the physical markings made of what you can call the first people, hunters and gatherers who call the San bush people, who you pronounce it Chan. It's very difficult to pronounce. But you can say San. So the San people who were actually made extinct in the very late actually, in the early 20th century. They were made extinct, and they had been persecuted by white colonial settlers and so on for a long, long time. But their kind of their culture and their markings in the landscape, San rock art, is a tradition that's been ongoing for like 30,000 years, and the final tracings are showing kind of contemporary motifs. So it's an extremely fascinating kind of cultural heritage, and the whole story of how that heritage has been treated and used in a kind of colonial and apartheid epistemology is of course a topic in itself, on its own rights. And I don't go into all of that, but I'm using the concepts and thinking of Deleuze and Guattari to try to understand what these markings are actually doing in the landscape. And through this interest, I allow myself to pursue this project, which is not a project I'd be funded for. It's more like a private interest, but I mean, this work derived out of the case, what happened when I was in Cape Town, when I was I was a victim of crime. I was assaulted, and I had an experience of what you can call trauma. My whole way of thinking about myself and the environment was completely deformed for a while. So I'm drawing on the work of Catherine Malabou in terms of what that does to your brain, what trauma is and what it means. So that is kind of enfolded in this chapter. And it includes a take on sort of questioning the linearity of conducting research and the linearity of rational thinking that's somehow embedded in what we're supposed to be doing as scientists. So, and the whole idea that science is in itself, you could say, the kind of classical Western paradigm of science in itself, you can understand it as a traumatic thing to distance yourself from your situation and to kind of apply other categories in terms of the environment that you're in fact embedded into. So there's something interesting there, I think. And one of the pieces that I'm really sort of allowing this chapter to end up with is this extremely fascinating, extremely inaccessible piece, sand rock art piece, and it's called Fight and Flight. You can get a sense of it here on this photograph. And it's not, I mean, you have to know where it is. I was lucky to meet somebody who could take me there. And it's very mysterious. Nobody knows when it was made, by whom, and so on. It's really different from other sand rock art pieces. Anyway, there's loads of different kind of interpretations of this piece, but the name itself, the way it's been called, Fight and Flight, is extremely interesting, I think, because it's got this kind of complex knotting together. Of course, fight and flight are the two kind of basic affects that promote agency, that make us move. We fight or flight. So that's what this chapter is about. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catharina. I would like to invite the next speaker, Jennifer Mack, who is a researcher also from KTH Stockholm, but you're also affiliated to IBF Uppsala University.
Thank you. Thank you, Mattias. I also just wanted to say thank you to the environment for the postdoc that I had at the beginning of this project, because it was really, I mean, this is not hyperbolic to say it was life-changing, so I just wanted to throw that in there. In my work, I've been developing an idea of urban design from below, which is related in part to my PhD research before I joined the environment, but is also related to my postdoctoral project, Big Faith, which is about mosques and churches. But I'm trying to theorize how immigrants are changing the built environment. And in a nutshell, the idea of urban design from below focuses on how the construction of new architecture and new ways of using the existing city eventually accumulate into large changes that you can see at the urban scale. So it's a material condition that operates at architecture but affects the urban environment. And I'm looking at this very closely and in a number of different ways in my book, which is coming out at the end of October, beginning of November, The Construction of Equality, Syriac Immigration, and the Swedish City. And in it, I'm studying how Syriac Orthodox Christians who started to come to Södertälje as refugees and labor migrants in 1967 have changed spaces and design practices over a 50-year period in connection with the development of the Million Program. So I look both at architectural history and urban history, but also the history of this group. So building by building, urban design, which I see is usually defined as a top-down practice, is done from below. And I'm kind of looking to this as a counterpoint to the ways that non-designers' agency in ideas like guerrilla urbanism or everyday urbanism have been described before. And this, I'm trying to go a little bit further in that it's not after design, that you're not kind of occupying spaces that already exist, but actually making the city. So in Södertälje, plans drawn in the mid-1960s show the neighborhood of Yaneta with linear housing, wide lawns, and a town center. But as you see in the aerial view at the bottom, there have been major changes since then, especially to this blank strip at the top left. In the areas first zoned for open space, Yaneta now has strip malls, a large church, a football arena, and other so-called unplanned uses. And what was interesting to me was to discover that Syriac Orthodox Christians were behind all of them. And this is what I call urban design from below. So when 205 Syriac Christians came to Sweden from Lebanon in 1967 as refugees, the majority were Syriac Orthodox and originally from Turkey and Syria, where they were a minority group. But today, Södertälje is seen as their entire diasporic global capital city, which they call Mesopotamia. So Yaneta Centrum opened in 1969, and it followed diagrams like this, which were published. This one was published in a community magazine in Södertälje. It included service spaces for a post office, a grocery store, a library, and later the Swedish church St. Michael's. But this strip that you see here was left open, and it was zoned to remain unbuilt. And what's interesting to me is that this is actually where the Syriacs created their first major building. So after arriving to Sweden, Syriacs held religious services in living rooms. They later borrowed and rented spaces from the Church of Sweden, and they were not provided with a site to build until the early 1980s because of political pressures and a supposed lack of space. But they finally did get a site to build a church in Yaneta. And despite the long wait, however, the church design that you can see here, this is the original, was very subdued, a brick facade with a discrete cross. David, a Syriac entrepreneur in his late 50s, described this to me. I did a series, it was an ethnographic and an archival historical research project, so I did a lot of interviews and discussions with people. But he told me in the beginning, it was a mere industrial building that they built. The Swedish architect really had no clue about our traditions. But the blank facade actually hid a very ornate interior, as craftspeople made reliefs, columns, paintings, and stained glass. And one man in his 50s told me, I remember how the older gentleman worked on the altar, everything by hand. On the outside, it was plain brick, and on the inside, it was unbelievably beautiful. So this church opened for Christmas services in 1983. And as the group got larger and larger in Sortalia in 1985, they applied to construct a bell tower. They later added a barrel vault, cupolas, and an ornate entrance, which ultimately reduced this divide between the interior and the exterior. This is a view of the church more recently. So after adding a banquet hall to serve the church nearby, which is the first building you see next to it, Syriacs built other structures, and the strip is today an active commercial and social space. It includes the broadcasting station for Suryoyo Sat television channel, which broadcasts all over the world, the headquarters of the Syrianska Federation and the Syrianska Youth Organization. There are banquet halls, wedding planning services, and flower shops that are all owned by Syriacs. And one man in his 60s described the appeal of this concentration to me. He said it's located outside of the Swedish community, which is better because it's not in the people's eye. You can be as many people as you want and not disturb others. So other blocks include an indoor playground and furniture stores with products from the Middle East. But today, the planned town center of Yaneta Centrum is completely dead, as one Syriac woman told me. Its depopulated space has only a few surviving businesses. So in a sense, building this church catalyzed a change for the entire district that made an edge, what was an edge, a center. So in other words, urban design from below works slowly and makes new centers of gravity. And in contrast to the Million program, which quickly sliced its way through the Swedish landscape in just 10 years, the Syriac metamorphosis comes through what I see as a long-term accumulation that you can see building up in these aerial views. A church, then a banquet hall, then maybe a restaurant or an office, and so on. So, and you can obviously know that Syriacs have not produced a master plan for their Mesopotamia, but they have infiltrated official plans with official architecture in permanent and costly ways. And this is a diagram of that strip with a legend so you can see what's there now. So in Sortalia, urban design, which is usually seen as a professional act done from above, has happened building by building from below. It comes not exclusively from architects or planners' computers, but from Syriacs' piecemeal efforts to get their plans onto those computers. So this is not professional design disappearing because they're still involved, the professional planners and architects, but it's not just resistance either by spatial practice that only has temporary effects. Urban design from below makes those usually seen as just mere users of urban space its creators. So this is a material condition at the urban scale that I've been investigating, and it has many different iterations, but this one is one of the most interesting to me. So I'm going to leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Next speaker is Emma Nilsson, Associate Lecturer from Lund University School of Architecture. Welcome.
Why is this? Okay. Okay, thank you. Yes, my name is Emma Nilsson, and here I'm going to present some research that I've conducted as part of a postdoctoral project that was funded by one of the strong research environments, the one located in Chalmers, making. Well, in my previous research, I've been studying the making of parkour and how architecture takes part in shaping different body cultures and thereby specific body figurations related to these body cultures. Doing research on parkour, I was mostly concerned with urban materialities and everyday built environments. And in this study, I have shifted focus to the scale of buildings. The reasons for this is because I think there's a strong theoretical development within architectural research on the urban level, though there are still things to do on the building scale, you could say. Well, architects have been by many criticized for having a vague conception of the body in relation to architecture. The awareness that does exist is constructed mainly along two different lines of thoughts. It is either in a general and self-identical manner, or through standardized measurements related to different ideal bodies or building regulations. And so architects' conceptualization is thereby handed over to a standardized norm, which belongs to everyone and no one at the same time, or to a highly specific body experience that, regarded of the entire field, renders invisible all those who do not correspond to the average architect. How troubling it might be that architects may have a simplified relationship to the bodies inhabiting their buildings do not necessarily reflect this simplification. And so in order to bypass, you could say, this simplification, I've turned to the buildings themselves, asking how buildings make and shape different bodies, and thereby developing a relational perspective on bodies and architecture in dialogue with the writings of Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, John Law, and Anne-Marie Moll. The outcome of my postdoctoral investigations, it's structured as readings on 4 different buildings, all well known within architectural practice and education, and also part in a repertoire of examples on how to deal with and imagine bodies. The 4 buildings and the readings of them, they are collected as a small book that will be directed towards practicing architects and students in architecture. One of these readings is on Maison Bordeaux, the building we know as designed by Rem Koolhaas at UMA and Cecil Bollman from Arup. One of the more striking aspects of this particular building, and which is shown by the documentary by Lemoine and Becca, is how the architecture of Maison Bordeaux continuously have to be enacted in order to present itself as perceived in the design process. You could say that the building makes and shapes different working bodies, where some bodies have to be are more long-lasting in their formation in relation to the building's spatial configurations and materialities, and others arise in a brief encounter with the building's windows, joysticks, grassed roofs and watering systems, leaks, etc., etc. But my main reading of this building is concerned with the making of a family and the different positions or bodies assembled within this family. From a feminist and queer readings, we know that categories such as class, gender, sexuality, etc., they are not stable entities or identities and experiences. They intersect dependent not only on different positions within each category, but also in relations to shifts in materialities, temporalities, and spatial configurations. If we add to these categories also functionality, and thereby cripping feminist and queer thinking, the materialities of different bodies are brought forward in the investigation. The actual body is enhanced, showing how bodies are simultaneously biographical and situated. And looking at the building as such, you could see that it destabilizes the boundaries between able and disabled bodies in, you could say, answering to the request of the father in the family and his condition as, at a turning point in his own life where he found himself tied to a wheelchair. You could say that the architecture liberates him and frees him from a position that otherwise is kind of destined to those that we label as disabled bodies. You could say then that in the meeting with the architecture of the Maison Bordeaux, the body shifts from being a disabled to an able body in that sense. But if we turn to, you could say, the boundaries that are usually drawn by the figure or the body of the father or the mother as a caring body, the architecture is not quite as challenging, since, for instance, the bedrooms of the children are located so that the father can never take the role of the caring parent reading bedtime stories, for instance. The overarching title of this presentation is a reference to the book Architects People that is edited by Russell Ellis and Dana Cuff, who's in the audience here, and more precisely to her interviews with 7 different American architects on their people. And these are, with her words, and she might correct me for getting it wrong, these are the real and imagined people constructed out of personal insight, experience, self-reflection, theories, colleagues, and observations of the anonymous public. You could say they are the bodies accompanying architects in their design practice. And though my own research is concerned with the bodies that are shaped by architecture and the politics enacted by this, rather than the ideological implications of architects' conceptions of bodies, my research could be regarded as an act of hope to sharpen the understanding on how architecture is part in articulating different bodies and thereby widening the kind of companions that are encompassed in architects' people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. And now I'd like to introduce Paulina Prieto de la Fuente, who is a PhD student at the School of Architecture, Lund University. So, welcome.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, good. My PhD project departs from 4 research questions, and I will throw you straight into one of them and let this talk circle around it. And hopefully in this short time also manage to squeeze all the other things in that I worked with. I'll read the question out loud. By what representational means can rhythmic and sequential connections of spatial events be visualized? And I will give you a brief background. I was interested in addressing temporality and temporal aspects of architecture, and there are multiple ways of doing this. Even so, many attempts at capturing dynamic building processes have often been reduced to static categories and representations. So why is it so hard to describe an architecture in motion, an architecture caught in action? For me, it's the fleeting moment, the moving or repeating forces of lived life, rather than the static or predefined representations of architecture that is of interest, and that is also what has driven this project forwards. I've focused on the micro rhythms that connect everyday life situations with the built environment, placing architecture in between the subjective experience and the objective experiential frame. My fieldwork has been located in a square in Malmö called Värnhemstorget, and it takes an interest in some of the common tools that urban designers and architects use, like the drawing, the collage, the photo, and the field notes. So I will give you a few examples of techniques that I've tried. Time-lapse photography comes first, because I started really early with that. I thought it was an ingenious idea to record rhythms with, but the sequential pictures rather created or inserted rhythms to the square than documenting or following them. But still, the time-lapse pictures have been useful as a way of manipulating time, of adding to the open observations that I was also doing on site. And they helped me notice small things or things deviating from the main rhythms, especially when I focused on the built environment. I processed them differently. I've made little films. I've made quantitative attempts at trying to count people and cars, for example. and I printed them into flipbooks. I made themed flipbooks that I called the hamburger, the beer can, etc. I'll show you a short sequence of 20 pictures out of, in total, more or less, more than 4,000 pictures. It's from December. I've also worked with collages. They functioned here as a way of superimposing time or temporalities. First of all, I started collaging to try and put together ideas that I had from the time-lapse materials and observations. And for me, it was also a way to anonymize persons that I talked to or overheard that I wanted to bring in. I also made collages with students in workshops within a course in the 4th year. The assignment that they made departed from a conceptualization that I worked on that I've called discrete architecture, which is defined as fragmented formless architectures that combine architectural elements or spaces and reappear rhythmically. Discrete architectures transgress traditional boundaries in architecture, like inside and outside, and so on. The students were asked to follow rhythm figures, things or objects that appear briefly in the square, like coffee mugs, free newspapers, or cigarettes, and make collages out of what they found in their field day. In the discussions with the students, important issues related to urban design surfaced that challenge hegemonic ideals about public life and roles of human and non-human actors in the square. A few brief examples. This is a collage of a group that followed cigarettes. It shows interactions between smokers, cigarettes, and the built environment, pilings of cigarette butts, and almost like little cigarette stations. The next one is a group that followed free newspapers, and this one shows how the free newspaper takes part in different activities in the square. This one is also a group that followed free newspapers, where on a very windy day, where the newspaper almost became like a performer on the stage, taking up a lot of space in the open space in the square. I've also worked with something that I've called, or that I don't call it, I've worked with unfolded sections, and I will now read an excerpt out of my thesis out loud. Now, imagine a line that connects spaces and also cuts through the built materials so that thicknesses, distances, closures, and boundaries show. The first point in the line is the interior space of a shop, a medium-sized commercial space with a large window and a door to the street. The second point is the bus stop, an open space with built variations in the ground, signs and paper bins. The third one is in the platform stairs, also an open space with variations in the ground, in this case the steps of granite stone. The line marks a way of an unfolded section. It's not straight, as in the most common section drawings. It's fictional, but based on one of many situations that involve cigarettes observed and found in many of the empirical collections made in the square. The unfolded section might also be called phenomenological section because of its way to give a more subjective view of architecture than the more traditional and objective section. The line gives opportunity to visualize a discrete architecture, a cigarette architecture. So the unfolded section can be expressed in words, but it can also be drawn or collaged. And like this, it's one way of representing rhythmic architecture. Okay, so I have presented to you examples of ways that I've investigated the aspects of architecture that I found interesting in my PhD work. And I've also hopefully showed you that I found different ways and also that they, in this research process, relate to each other. So did I manage to squeeze all my work in? No. I did not have time, for example, to talk about how temporality in the built environment relate to intended programs, common use, and traditional comprehensions of architectural and urban space. Neither did I have time to talk about the chronopolitical implications that are evoked by rhythm-based urban studies and through discrete connections in architecture. So if that sounds interesting, please stay tuned for my upcoming dissertation with a working title, Rhythm Architecture, on sequential aspects of materialities in urban space. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Paulina. And we are now at the final speaker of this session on material conditions. And the final speaker is Jilly Traganou, who is an associate professor in spatial design studies at the Parsons School of Design, New York. We're happy to have you here. Welcome. Let's see if I could.
Thank you very much. It is really a privilege to be here. And like most of you, I have a background in architecture, but my work stands more at the intersection of the affiliated fields of design studies and studies of urbanization. And as you can see from my title, my entry point to the question of materiality will be from the point of view of political action and dissent. And I would like to start with a diagnosis of the present moment that would help us contextualize the dissent that we see unfolding globally in relation to the planetary processes of urbanization. The deficit of democracy that we witness, what is happening? Today in political life has also crucial effects in the realm of urbanization. Not only decisions about the city are happening with the absence of citizens' participation, but they systematically privilege the economic elites and those in power. What we experience today is a fundamental redefinition of the urban form and its raison d'etre as a special unit of collective consumption, which was noted by Emmanuel Castells in the 1970s. According to this definition, that has now become obsolete, the city is now a space where socialized common goods, such as education, protection of public health, and mass transit, are consumed and contested collectively. But since the 1980s, the urban has become an arena of capital reproduction through a variety of offensive means, such as dispossession of land, confiscation of the commons, divestment, and handling goods of collective consumption to privatization. According to David Harvey, at the root of all this is the valorization of urban space as a commodity or as a pure financial asset. Within this framework, any interest in the protection of citizens' rights or civic institutions has been abandoned for the blunt protection of capital, especially from the point of view of the US and other parts of Europe, maybe not from Sweden at this point. In response to this, we witness today the creation of a planetary urban class of denizens with less and less rights, threatened to be dispossessed and displaced. Thus, many people worldwide take to the streets as protesters, demonstrating their indignation and claiming their rights as inhabitants in a given territory. At the same time, several decide to take alternative paths. Some take it upon themselves to reveal urban injustice and grievance, to induce public awareness and advocate for change, both from the top and from below. Others decide to function as commoners, claiming spatial terrains where they can exercise alternative social practices and recover the commons or establish new ones. Others revise their professional capacity, trying to establish new processes of special provision that restore justice. And all these are models of urban citizenship that bridge thinking with practice, a type of citizenship which is removed from its conventional definition within the nation state. And there is a remarkable body of work produced and emerging, and we heard a great deal of this at the conference, and we saw also the exhibition of students' projects. Most of these positions are not conceived a priori in the realm of intellectual critique alone, but rather through bodily engagements with materiality, often in conditions of scarcity, or on behalf or together with those who are at risk. And I would like to use this opportunity to focus on a specific arena of sociopolitical action where engagement with materiality is paramount and unfolds on the side of the non-expert designer. I am especially interested in what Lefebvre calls differential spaces, which we see in events like the protest camps, such as Zuccotti Park or Standing Rock. Differential spaces operate against the eye and the gaze, trying to restore unity to what abstract space breaks up and open up new unpredictable opportunities, even in highly controlled territories, such as the financial district in New York, where we saw, for instance, the beginning of the Occupy movement. I'm especially interested in the type of politics that emerged in instances of differential space, which political theorists Winnie Brins and Grace Boggs have called prefigurative. Brins in particular defines a clash between strategic and prefigurative politics. The former are committed to bringing structural change in the political, economic, and social orders. They unfold with conventional marches, collection of signatures for petitions, or counter-hegemonic acts that seek to seize power. Prefigurative politics, on the other hand, strive to provide living examples of alternative social formations. What they prefigure is a desired society, and they do so by creating the new in the shell of the old. These cases are of interest to me because they go beyond demands, and in the words of Mark Purcell, they are efforts to forge positive alternatives, to invent democratic collectives that can think and act outside the state and outside the market. From the point of view of material production, narrowly defined, there is not much that could be seen as novel or radical in a protest camp. In the Standing Rock, for instance, one might be surprised to find byproducts of our unsustainable civilization, such as batteries and propane, mixed with straw bales and solar chargers. But from a perspective of socio-material practice, there are several radical things happening. Despite the fact that many of these objects derive from capitalist modes of production, their assemblages are suggesting economies and material practices that are based on sustaining resources, sharing, and developing communal bonds. One should remember that prefigurative practice is not waiting for the total revolution. Its aim is to reconfigure the new in the very shell of the old. In that way, they remind us of designerly prototypes, precarious and perishable. So one of the questions I'm asking in my research is, in what category of design does the making in the protest camps belong? Material practice here unfolds primarily in the realm of what I call agentic design or proto-design, design that emerges from the position of the non-expert, either as a spontaneous disagreement or in acts of survival in conditions of risk. This type of production is integrated with every level of the camp's realization, from the making of its spatial structures to the distinctive bodily preferences of the protesters. These are some pictures from the Standing Rock. The creation of most of these forms does not depend on expert knowledge, but it is based on the development of agency-focused capabilities, peer-to-peer dissemination, and alternative pedagogies. But most importantly, the empowering capability of the camp emerges, in my opinion, from its embodied infrastructures, a term I use to characterize the interdependence of humans and things, which is at the root of the camp's DNA. I see these embodied infrastructures as assemblages of the social and the material, as what is created in the camp cannot exist without the support of the social. I'm interested in these mixed ontologies and the fact that in most of these cases, objects are indispensable, but they also need us to function. We do not delegate our ethics to these objects. But central here is also the reverse, the idea that it is through a radical intrasomatic engagement with things that the character of groups and individuals is being galvanized. According to John Dewey, the various publics do not exist a priori, but rather emerge through their very engagement with the field of material transactions. In the Standing Rock, these embodied infrastructures were exemplified by the water protectors. The protection of the water is not and cannot be delegated to machines. It requires the vigilance of the human and the cooperation with both the realms of the artificial and the natural. So I would like to end with my book of recommendations, to use a term we heard before. So, and I will propose a matrix of studying materiality in dissent. So beyond the particular case study of the protest camp that has been the focus of my academic interest in the last several years, I would like to zoom out and offer a matrix of inquiry for understanding the materiality of dissent. So this is just a matrix, not the matrix. So how are the collective material acts of dissent being conceived? What is the role of the collective and individual imaginary, chance and necessity in creating the idea that brought these things into being, especially considering that the stages of conception and making are often conflated in processes of dissent, especially when it comes from the structures of below and not from trained designers? What are the modes of production of material dissent, and how has the notion of authorship shifted from that of the individual designer to the distributed agency of the collective? How is labor being redefined or revalorized in this volunteering, collaborative context? And is there any distinction between work for creative dissent and creative labor? What are the tropes and modalities through which materialized dissent evokes disagreement? And here we can notice modalities of appropriation, hacking, subversion, humor, monstrosity, etc. What are the specialities and the geographies of dissent, and what are their networked arrangements? How are practices of dissent performed, disseminated, and adapted in various contexts? What types of habitus supports the materialization of protest? And last, the afterlives. When and how do these protest objects become circulated, commodified, trivialized, or commemorated? What do museums or collections do to disobedient objects when they hold them in their collections, which is something we notice more and more today? To summarize, although material outcomes of creative dissent are rarely true end products, we shouldn't see them simply as tools used towards a goal or as expressions of ideas that have a linguistic or legislative origin. Materialized forms of dissent initiate transformative political processes. To use the terms of Victoria Hatham and Jane Bennett, they initiate an unspoken political and provide the motivational energy needed to move us from the endorsement of ethical principles to the actual practice of ethical principles and behaviors. So my last sentence for the book of recommendations is that I would encourage both practitioners and researchers to follow how these new ethical behaviors are distributed and co-evolve from the molecules of things and the pores of our skin to the material bonds that sustain these communities of practice. Thank you.